America, in the mid-19th century, was not the united country that school children imagine today. It was a fractured nation, stitched together by compromise and torn apart by greed, ideology, and fear. The Constitution had promised liberty, yet millions lived in bondage. Every state, every politician, every citizen felt the weight of that contradiction. For men like my father, a farmer in the rolling fields of Ohio, the North represented progress. Railroads cutting through the land, factories belching smoke, and schools filled with children learning to read and write. The North saw itself as a beacon of modernity, but across the Mason-Dixon line, the South clung to a way of life built on cotton and slavery, where entire families of enslaved people were bought and sold as if they were cattle. I remember sitting at the family table one cold November evening in 1860 when the election results came in. Abraham Lincoln, a tall, lanky lawyer from Illinois, had been chosen as the 16th President of the United States. My father set down his cup of coffee and said quietly, "This is the beginning, James. Mark my words, the South won't accept this." I didn't understand then, but I would soon. The months that followed Lincoln's election were filled with headlines that stunned the nation. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, 1860, declaring that it would no longer be part of the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon followed. They called themselves the Confederate States of America, and they chose Jefferson Davis, a senator from Mississippi, as their president. It felt like a marriage breaking apart, bitterly and violently. The Union was the house, and half the family was moving out, slamming the door behind them. I remember overhearing my uncle, a veteran of the War of 1812, mutter, "This isn't secession, it's rebellion, and rebellions are put down with blood." His words chilled me, though I didn't know how true they would become. The spark at Fort Sumter. The final straw came in April 1861. In the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, stood a lonely federal fortress, Fort Sumter. When Confederate forces demanded its surrender and the Union refused, the South opened fire. For 34 straight hours, cannonballs rained down upon the fort until its walls crumbled and the Union soldiers inside were forced to surrender.
That was the beginning. When the news reached Ohio, church bells rang. Newspapers flew off the shelves, and men crowded the town squares, shouting about duty and honor. Some said, "The South has declared war on the Union." Others warned, "This will tear the country apart." I was only 18, but I felt a fire in my chest. My father wanted me to stay home, to tend the farm, but I could not. I believed it was my duty to defend the Union, to fight for the America I had been raised to believe in. Little did I know that this decision would change me forever. The call to arms. President Lincoln, shocked but resolute, called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. Across the North, young men rushed to enlist. I remember walking to the county courthouse, the air electric with excitement. Banners hung across the streets, painted with slogans like, "Save the Union," and "To arms, boys, to arms." The recruiters' table was crowded. Men were signing their names with bold strokes of ink, puffing out their chests with pride. When it was my turn, my hand shook slightly as I wrote, "James Collins, 18 years old, Ohio Volunteer Infantry." At that moment, I was no longer just a farm boy. I was a soldier. The feeling of departure. The day I left home, my mother wept silently on the porch. She pressed a small Bible into my hands and whispered, "Come back safe, James." My younger sister clung to my coat, refusing to let go until my father gently pulled her back. The train station was crowded with families saying their goodbyes. Steam hissed from the iron engine and flags waved in the wind. As the train pulled away, I leaned out the window, waving until the figures of my family blurred into the distance. I didn't know then if I would ever see them again.
The Union and the Confederacy were now two nations staring each other down across a bloody fault line. Every newspaper headline screamed of war, and every household felt its shadow. For President Abraham Lincoln, the burden was crushing. He had never commanded an army, never worn a uniform, yet he now carried the fate of millions upon his shoulders. His face, thin and gaunt, already showed the weight of sleepless nights. "We must preserve the Union at all costs," he declared. "A house divided against itself cannot stand." The South, meanwhile, burned with determination. Jefferson Davis rode before cheering crowds in Richmond, the new Confederate capital, promising independence and liberty, though for millions of enslaved people, those words were bitter lies. Confederate generals, many of them former officers of the U.S. Army, now pledged loyalty to their new cause. Among them was Robert E. Lee, a Virginian whose name would soon echo through history. The North's confidence. At first, people in the North believed the war would be over quickly. "Just one battle and we'll march right into Richmond," said politicians in Washington. Families picnicked on hillsides to watch the first great clash of armies, as if it were a game. Newspapers promised a swift victory. I too believed it. At 18, I thought war would be glorious, a chance to prove my courage, to stand shoulder to shoulder with other young men, to fight for something noble. None of us yet understood the horror that awaited. The South's fire. But the Confederacy had fire in its veins. The men of the South believed they were fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. They were fierce, determined, and led by generals of remarkable skill. I recall the words of a Southern prisoner captured later in the war. "You Yankees fight for pay and pride. We fight for everything we know." At that moment, I realized why the war would drag on longer than anyone had expected. The first clash, Bull Run, or Manassas. It was July 1861 when the Union Army, 35,000 strong, marched out of Washington toward a small Virginia creek called Bull Run. They wore bright blue uniforms, flags snapping in the summer wind, bands playing as if for a parade. I was there among them, my heart pounding with excitement. But war is no parade. The Confederates waited, entrenched and ready. The battle raged from morning until late afternoon. I remember the thunder of cannon fire shaking the earth, the cries of wounded men echoing across the fields, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. At first, it seemed we were winning. The Union troops pushed forward, driving the Confederates back. But then came a rally that changed everything. A Southern general, Thomas Jonathan Jackson, stood firm against the Union assault. "There stands Jackson like a stone wall," someone cried. From that day on, he was known as Stonewall Jackson. The Confederate counterattack swept us from the field. What began as confidence turned to chaos. Soldiers fled in panic, throwing down their rifles, running back toward Washington. Civilians who had come to watch the battle were caught in the stampede. I ran too, ashamed, terrified, and shaken to my core. We thought the war would be quick. Instead, Bull Run proved it would be long and merciless. Lincoln's resolve. When the news of our defeat reached Washington, the city fell into silence. The president did not despair, though his heart was heavy. Instead, he called for more men, 500,000 volunteers to fight until the rebellion was crushed. For us soldiers, the lesson of Bull Run was burned into our souls. This would not be easy. Many of us would not live to see the end. And yet, we stayed. We drilled harder, marched farther, and swore we would not run again.